Our gospel lesson this morning comes from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 8. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered him, "John the Baptist, and others, Elijah, and still others, one of the prophets." He asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it. And those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." This is the word of God for the people of God. I don't know about you, but Lent is still a fairly new experience for me. For the first 19 of my 25 years, I never really took the time to think about preparing for Easter. But over the past 6 years of celebrating this challenging and meaningful season in the Christian calendar, I think I'm starting to understand a few things about it. First, this kind of Lent is not the same as the fluffy stuff you have to clean out of the dryer after you do a load of laundry. It's also important to note that Lent is more than just an opportunity for us to reboot our New Year's resolutions. I'm preaching especially to myself on that one. And more than anything, I think Lent is a time to ask hard questions, especially of ourselves and our commitments. And that's exactly what we find today in this story from Mark. As I'm sure you've noticed, each gospel, each version of the Jesus story has its own way of showing us a different side of Jesus' ministry. The Gospel of Mark, the first one written, demands that we confront the question of what it means that Jesus is the Messiah. The very first place that Mark uses this title for Jesus is in chapter 1, verse 1. Mark tells us exactly who Jesus is from the beginning, but then shares the story so that we can discover that truth for ourselves. So the next time Mark uses that title, it comes from the mouth of Peter as he begins to discover a different aspect of who Jesus is in our passage. This interaction between Jesus and the disciples is quite literally in the center of Mark's account. This gospel is 16 chapters long, and we're smack in the middle of chapter 8. So this conversation is intended to be a turning point in the life of Jesus and in the life of his disciples. One commentator even points out that Jesus and his disciples are probably coming to the end of their journey in Galilee, which is to the north of Jerusalem. Jesus has spent almost all of the first 8 chapters in northern Israel, towns like Nazareth and Tyre, Capernaum, Bethsaida, and Sidon. But now he is beginning to turn his ministry more toward the south, namely, toward Jerusalem, where the promise of more ministry awaits. But so does suffering, betrayal, abandonment, and death. I say all that because we must recognize that Jesus is right in the middle of the story, in the middle of his journey, and the disciples have to come to a time of decision. With one conversation, he draws all of us in with a couple of pointed questions. Who do people say I am? Followed quickly by, but who do you say I am? The disciples are in the loop, and they've heard the word on the street that Jesus is a prophet, like John the Baptist or Elijah before him. And while Jesus is like those leaders, the disciples believe that he is more than just a prophet. So Peter names it directly. You are the Messiah. Bingo, the million-dollar question, and Peter didn't even have to phone a friend. But then Jesus begins to raise more questions in the verses that follow. The disciples are absolutely right that Jesus is the Messiah. But what does that mean? For the disciples, the arrival of the Messiah meant a return to Israel's golden age under the reign of King David. The inauguration of the Messianic age would feature the return of all of Israel's people, ownership of the land promised to them in the covenant with Abraham, and the royal reign of God made known through the Messiah himself. What thrilling news that must have been for the disciples, that Jesus is the Messiah, because it means that their struggle is over. The suffering is coming to an end, and the moment of glory is at hand as the Roman Empire is about to be overthrown. So imagine their shock when Jesus says that he is the Messiah, but not the kind they were expecting or hoping for. Jesus lays out plainly that he is the Messiah who will not conquer by violence, but will die by violence. The suffering has not come to an end. In fact, it's about to get worse. I think that's probably why Peter gets so upset that he thinks he needs to correct Jesus. That's exactly what Mark means by rebuke. Peter refuses Jesus' teaching to the point that he thinks Jesus needs some help understanding who he is. It's a combination of heartbreak and outrage as the realization of new responsibility settles in. Peter's rebuke is about more than just a shattered image of a friend and hoped-for king. It's because he knew if the Messiah would die, then nobody who follows him is safe. If the Messiah would die, maybe we have to as well. Following Jesus means running a painful risk that is quite often costly. This is something with which the late Billy Graham was very familiar. Graham received criticism from countless voices on many sides in his lifetime. But in spite of it all, Graham said, many people are willing to have Jesus as part of their lives as long as it doesn't cost them anything. I think Peter was content to follow Jesus around Galilee, being part of this world-changing ministry on the way to coming glory with the restoration of Israel. But in Jesus' teaching, we find some sobering questions that we all need to answer for ourselves today. Who is Jesus for me? And what does being his disciple actually mean? Is Jesus just the friendly presence who calls us to take up donuts and coffee on Sunday mornings? Or is he still the radical Messiah who calls us to take up the cross? One scholar inspired me to imagine just how much the journey has changed for the disciples since they started following Jesus at the beginning. Peter, at that time, was called Simon. He was the very first disciple called way back in chapter 1. We can imagine the day, maybe even like the past few days here. Warm, sunny, the smell of salt in the air as calloused hands gripped a rough net and pulled it in again from the gleaming water. Peter's waterlogged feet stand in a wooden boat with damp clothes and a sweaty brow, when suddenly a stranger shuffles over with a compelling word. Follow me, and I will make you fish for people. Simon and his brother Andrew dropped their nets then and gave up their livelihood in order to pursue this prophetic presence. These words in chapter 8 are just as prophetic and compelling, but the sun on the shore has disappeared behind the clouds, leaving only the faint outline of a cross in the distance. And suddenly Jesus is calling his disciples to leave behind much more than their nets. He's asking them to give up their expectations, to give up their dreams of personal power and national glory. They thought they were on their way to political victory. They thought they had Jesus figured out. They thought they were prepared to follow him anywhere. But they never thought the shore by the sea would become a hill with a cross. Friends, the way of discipleship rarely goes the way we think. And in these demanding verses, Jesus shows us that discipleship is not about what we think. Rather, discipleship is about what we do. In verse 29, Peter makes a bold confession that Jesus is the Messiah, and he's right. But following Jesus requires more than just easy platitudes and right belief. Folks, it isn't enough for us to be right at 11:30 on Sunday mornings. It isn't enough for us to confess with Peter that Jesus is the Messiah when we're joined together with the family of God in this sacred space. We have to consciously and consistently choose to do something about it out there, Monday through Saturday. And what does Jesus want us to do according to this passage? What are the words on the page? Follow, deny, take up, lose, forfeit. That's a heavy list for 21st century Americans who have grown rather comfortable with leading, satisfying, winning, and competing. You and I are far removed from the original audience of this gospel, when criminals and enemies of Rome were regularly left hanging on crosses that they carried to their deaths. The Roman cross was among the most terrifying of images to the early believers who recorded Mark's gospel. So what does it mean for us to carry the cross in 2018? What is an image for Americans that communicates a similar kind of distress? As I've been thinking through what that might look like, let me demonstrate a suggestion. Feel free to follow along in your seat. I think there are a lot of us who approach life like this. We're holding on to something with a clenched fist. We're We're holding on to everything. Everything from high expectations of ourselves and others to rigid political positions that say we have to be correct and somebody else is wrong. You and I are holding on to worries about the future, regrets from the past, and somehow in the tension between those, we're holding on to the exhaustion of the present. Some of you may be holding on to what you're having for lunch after church, or how you're dreading another Monday tomorrow and the bustle of another week. We're holding on. But Jesus tells us to do this: to let go, to have open hands and open arms. And y'all, that's unsettling. It's terrifying, actually. Open hands and open arms. Just this image of me before you. And the feeling in this moment means that I am surrendering. It means that I am defenseless. It means that I'm vulnerable. And I'll tell you something else. Perhaps this posture that you see is familiar. I hope it is. Because this is exactly how Jesus died. With open hands and open arms. This is the posture and the way of the cross. It's what Jesus called his disciples to then. And it's what he calls us to now. He calls us to let go and open our arms. But friends, we do not stand alone. The crucified Christ stands beside us, scars and all, as we die to our selfishness to find his abundance. When we take a risk to open our arms to the suffering of the world, we will quickly find that the Messiah is standing with us. Closed fists only find isolation. For if we come to Jesus with closed fists, or we're holding on to something else, it means that we can't take up the cross that he calls us to bear. And we can't take Jesus' hand to lead us through the suffering if our hands aren't open. You can't take the hand of someone else in this community. You can't take the hand of the person sitting next to you who may be suffering today if your hands aren't open. Jesus is our Messiah. He is our Savior. And as he saves us from ourselves, he calls us to his way of doing, of risking, of opening. So, are you? Oh God, may it be so.